The sun was beginning to set over the quiet town, casting long shadows across the dusty parking lot of the local gas station. The sky painted in shades of orange and pink, an idyllic backdrop for the kind of evening that promised nothing more than routine. The hum of cars filling up, the distant murmur of a small-town world that rarely changed, were all part of the peace that seemed to settle over the area. The kind of peace that came with familiarity. But this night, like no other, was about to introduce something different, a disruption that would echo through the lives of everyone involved. Michael Stone had just returned home. After a long deployment overseas, he was ready for the simplicity of life back in his town. There was no fanfare, no grand celebration awaiting him, just a longing to sink into the comforts of normality. The hard steel of his military life had softened over time. His family had long since moved on with their lives, and his friends had scattered. Still, this town, small and quiet, had been home for as long as he could remember, and for that, he was grateful. He pulled his old Chevy into the station and parked it at the farthest pump. The engine rumbled to a stop, and Michael took a deep breath, savoring the scent of fresh air that filled his lungs. There was something uniquely grounding about moments like this. The kind that made you feel like you were exactly where you were meant to be. His boots clicked against the concrete as he stepped out of the truck and made his way to the pump. The gas station was quiet, save for the occasional sound of an engine turning over and the whir of the air pump filling tires. Michael was used to the solitude. He wasn't one to strike up conversations with strangers or linger in public spaces. He preferred the quiet, the stillness of his own thoughts, and a good cup of coffee. A soft breeze ruffled his short-cropped hair as he unscrewed the cap of the gas tank and started pumping. He didn't notice the group of bikers pulling in from the opposite side of the parking lot at first. But he would soon enough. The rumble of engines grew louder, a sound that always seemed to demand attention. The bikes, heavy and loud, pulled up to the pumps in a cluster. Leather jackets glinted in the dimming light, and patches emblazoned with bold insignia caught the eye. These were no ordinary riders, this was a gang that had been known to stir trouble wherever they went. There were 5 of them in total, their rough, weathered faces hardening as they took in their surroundings. The leader, a tall man with a thick beard and tattooed arms, glanced toward Michael but said nothing. They were used to their presence being enough, their sheer audacity and bravado intimidating anyone who might think of challenging them. Michael, engrossed in his task, didn't initially notice them, or if he did, he wasn't concerned. He'd seen all kinds of people over the years, and bikers were no different from anyone else to him. He had dealt with enough dangerous situations in his military career to not be easily rattled. But this group, as it turned out, wasn't here for the gas. They had noticed Michael. More importantly, they had noticed his military haircut, his trim figure, and his general air of someone who didn't quite belong in their world. They took one look at him and immediately decided that he was an easy target, one that needed to be put in his place. The bearded biker, the one who seemed to lead the group, sauntered over toward Michael, a sly grin spreading across his face. "Hey, soldier," he said, his voice rough but deliberate, "you lost, or just filling up your little toy truck?" The rest of the group laughed, their cackles loud and mocking, cutting through the evening air. Michael glanced up, his brow furrowing ever so slightly. He wasn't sure what to make of the sudden attention. He had learned long ago that when you were in a uniform, whether military or otherwise, you attracted a certain kind of gaze. Some admired you. Some resented you. Some simply saw an opportunity for a cheap laugh. It didn't matter. What mattered was keeping control of the situation. He didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he focused on the pump, finishing up what he had come to do. But the bearded biker wasn't ready to let things go so easily. He stepped forward, getting uncomfortably close, eyeing Michael's military insignia. "You think you're all tough with your little army, huh?" he spat, his voice laced with mockery. "Bet you wouldn't last a second out here with real men like us." The laughter from the others grew louder, now joining in. Michael's hand gripped the handle of the gas pump a little tighter, but he still didn't respond. He wasn't here to fight. He was here to go home, to move past the past, and maybe just get through one night without any trouble. But the bikers weren't about to let him go that easily. One of the other bikers, a younger man with a tattoo of a skull on his neck, stepped forward, circling around to Michael's side. "Yeah, I bet you can't even handle a real man's bike," he taunted, pointing to Michael's old Chevy. "That thing's a joke. You should get yourself something with some muscle." The group laughed again, and the atmosphere shifted, thickening like a storm cloud. It was no longer just about the truck or the bikers' taunts. It had turned into a challenge, a test of strength, of toughness. And Michael could feel it. Michael paused, his breath steady. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want to be the guy who fought back at the gas station, who made headlines for all the wrong reasons. He knew what was at stake. Too many veterans had ended up in prison or worse for less. He was better than that. But he also knew something else. He wasn't going to let these men walk all over him, not without a fight. The bearded biker was now standing just a few feet away from him, crossing his arms over his chest, clearly expecting some sort of reaction. "What's the matter, soldier? You scared of us? You look like you're about to cry." The words were meant to provoke, and they worked. Michael felt a rush of adrenaline. He had trained for this. He had been through more intense, high-stress situations than he cared to recall. But there was something about the way these bikers sneered at him, like he was beneath them, that sparked a fire inside him. The thought of letting this group believe they could push him around was worse than anything else. He put the gas pump back into its holder and turned to face the biker who had been speaking. "You want to try me, you're welcome to," he said, his voice steady but filled with an undeniable edge. "But know this, I won't go down without a fight." The biker's grin faltered, just for a moment. He hadn't expected this kind of response. But before he could say anything, the rest of the gang started to shift uncomfortably. One of them, a big man with a leather vest, nudged the leader, suggesting they move along. But the leader wasn't ready to back down. He wanted to prove something, show that he and his gang could dominate anyone, even a soldier. And so, the tension grew. The moment that had started so innocently, so routine, was now something much more. Michael could feel it in the air, the rising electricity, the thick atmosphere of impending chaos. He had been in tight spots before, but this was different. These men were about to find out the hard way that they had underestimated the wrong person. As the leader stepped closer, Michael braced himself for what was to come. The calm of the evening had vanished, replaced by a sense of inevitability. Something was about to happen, and it was going to change everything. The air seemed to thicken with every second that passed. Michael stood his ground, but his mind was racing. This wasn't how he had pictured his return to normal life. He had imagined peaceful nights, maybe even a bit of nostalgia for his younger days, but not this, being surrounded by a gang of men who thought they could push him around simply because of what he wore. His hands clenched into fists, the leather of his jacket creaking ever so slightly as he stood tall, trying to exude calm. The leader, clearly deciding that this was the moment to assert dominance, took a few steps closer, his boots scraping against the concrete with a menacing sound. He wasn't just trying to provoke Michael, he was trying to humiliate him. The rest of the bikers stood back, watching, some smirking, others looking more like they were waiting for a signal to move in. They thought they had the upper hand. They thought that a single soldier, standing alone, wasn't a match for 5 men with a reputation for causing trouble. "You really think you can take me on, huh?" the bearded biker taunted, stepping even closer, until he was just a foot away from Michael. The smell of cigarette smoke and cheap cologne hung in the air, mixing with the faint scent of gasoline. The bearded man looked down at Michael, his eyes cold and calculating. He knew the game: instigate, push, and wait for a reaction. You should know that not everyone's afraid of you and your little army. We're real men, soldier. We've earned our place here." He chuckled darkly, as if Michael were the punchline of some cruel joke. Michael felt a flash of anger rise within him, but he suppressed it. He'd spent years training himself to stay calm under pressure, to think before acting. The military had taught him how to assess a situation, how to calculate risks, and how to control his emotions in the heat of the moment. But this was different. This wasn't an enemy he could confront with tactics or weapons. This was about pride, and he knew that responding too aggressively could escalate the situation into something he didn't want to deal with. He was no longer in the service, he was just a guy at a gas station, trying to get home. The gang leader's voice grew louder, more mocking. "What's the matter, soldier? You too scared to show us what you're made of? You're out of your element here. These streets, this town, it's ours. You're just passing through, just a little cog in a machine that doesn't even know its own purpose." Michael's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it felt as though time had slowed. He wasn't thinking about the bikers or the insults, they were insignificant in the grand scheme of things. What mattered was the principle. What mattered was standing up for what was right, even if it wasn't easy. But just as he was about to open his mouth, the sound of a truck engine revved loudly from the entrance of the parking lot, interrupting the tension. The bikers turned their heads instinctively, distracted for a moment. The newcomer was a man with a heavy build, his truck an older model with a deep rumbling engine that seemed to echo through the parking lot. It was clear that the man driving it wasn't concerned with making a statement, he wasn't trying to impress anyone. The truck, beaten up from years of use, seemed to speak volumes about the kind of person behind the wheel. He pulled into a spot just a few yards away from Michael's Chevy, the truck's engine cutting off with a loud thud. As the door slammed shut, the newcomer stepped out. His face was hard, his eyes dark and serious, scanning the parking lot. The bikers, distracted by the truck's sudden arrival, shifted their focus, momentarily losing interest in Michael. The newcomer, clearly not one to back down, walked towards the gas station entrance with a purposeful stride. He didn't glance at Michael or acknowledge the bikers, his eyes were fixed on something else entirely. But the bikers, sensing another person they could either challenge or ignore, decided to test him as well. The leader, feeling the weight of their collective attention, called out to the newcomer, trying to gauge if he would be just another easy target. "Hey, buddy, you lost too? Or just picking a fight?" the leader sneered, his tone dripping with contempt. The newcomer paused, his shoulders tense but not yet turning around. Michael could sense a quiet confidence in the man, he wasn't reacting to the challenge the way most people would. Instead, the newcomer turned slightly, casting a glance over his shoulder without saying a word. The bikers were already circling, trying to read the man's body language, sizing him up. It was clear they thought they could control the situation. But they didn't know what they were dealing with. The newcomer let out a soft chuckle, then, with a movement so fast it was almost imperceptible, he spun on his heel and headed straight for the bikers, never breaking his pace. His eyes locked with the leader's, a look that made the gang leader pause for just a split second. The air grew heavy again as the bikers realized they weren't dealing with someone who would cower or back down. They were facing someone who knew how to stand his ground. Before the tension could escalate any further, Michael, still standing where he had been moments before, took a deliberate step forward. He wasn't sure what the newcomer was about to do, but he knew that if this situation got any worse, he'd have to act. The gang leader wasn't backing down, and neither was the newcomer. What started as a simple confrontation over pride was now turning into a standoff, an unpredictable situation that could spiral out of control in an instant. "Hey," Michael said, his voice low but firm. He was addressing the leader of the bikers but watching the newcomer closely as well. "This isn't the way to handle things. You've made your point, but don't push it further." Michael's gaze never wavered. The words hung in the air between him and the bikers, heavy with meaning. He wasn't threatening them, but he wasn't giving in either. He was standing his ground, trying to be the voice of reason. The gang leader's eyes flickered from Michael to the newcomer, and for a brief moment, the two seemed to size each other up. The newcomer didn't flinch. He didn't back down. It was as if he was saying with every movement that he wasn't afraid to face what was coming next. His unspoken confidence unnerved the bikers more than any words could. This wasn't just some stranger at a gas station. This was someone who carried weight, someone who, like Michael, had a presence that commanded respect. After a long, tense moment, the gang leader finally broke the silence, his voice now lacking the earlier bravado. All right. Let's get out of here. This ain't worth it." He nodded toward the others, signaling the end of the confrontation. The bikers turned, slowly at first, and began walking back toward their bikes. But their eyes never fully left Michael or the newcomer, who continued to stand tall, his posture unyielding. The sound of engines revving broke the tension as the bikers mounted their bikes one by one. They weren't retreating in fear, but they were leaving with their pride somewhat bruised. Michael and the newcomer watched as the gang rode off, their roar of engines fading into the distance. He glanced at the newcomer, whose face was still hard, unreadable. The tension that had clouded the parking lot began to dissipate, and the quiet of the evening settled in once again. Michael took a moment to collect himself before approaching the man who had just stepped in when things seemed to be about to explode. "Thanks for that," Michael said, offering a brief nod of acknowledgement. The newcomer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he eyed Michael for a moment, sizing him up the same way he had the bikers. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "It wasn't for you. It was for them. People like that, they don't understand what it's like to be pushed around. They don't know who they're messing with." His eyes narrowed slightly, as if recalling something darker. Michael nodded, understanding the unspoken words. He knew exactly what the man meant. They had both been pushed to the edge, but they had also both found a way to keep control, to regain what had been almost lost in that moment of tension. With the bikers gone, the evening returned to its peaceful, almost uneventful rhythm. Michael finished filling up his truck, paid for the gas, and turned toward the road. As he got in and started the engine, the last words of the "she" had stood firm. And that was enough. Tranger echoed in his mind. Sometimes, it wasn't about fighting back or proving something, it was about standing your ground when the world tried to push you down. Michael pulled out of the parking lot, the engine of his Chevy humming as he drove off into the night. But as he passed by the gas station once more, he glanced at the spot where the bikers had been. The parking lot was quiet again, but the memory of the night would linger longer than he expected. It had started as a typical stop for gas. But for Michael, it was a reminder that even the quietest moments could turn into the ones that defined you. Sometimes, all it took was one decision, one moment to either step back or stand firm. The events at the gas station weren't over. Michael had driven away, trying to shake off the adrenaline that still buzzed through his veins. But the quiet of the road didn't ease his mind. It was as if the universe had thrown him into a test, one he didn't ask for but had to face. He thought about the bikers, their cruel taunts, the way they thought they could walk all over him, and about the stranger, the man who had stepped in when things looked like they might turn violent. That stranger had been more than just a passerby. He had been a force of nature, one that made the bikers rethink their behavior. As Michael's truck rumbled along the dark highway, he kept replaying the moment in his mind. He thought about how he could have reacted differently, how he could have taken a swing at the leader and ended the standoff right then and there. But something had held him back. Something inside him told him not to fight fire with fire. He wasn't sure what had made him step in front of the bikers, but he was glad he had. The idea of just walking away from that kind of aggression, it felt wrong. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made the right choice. A few miles down the road, Michael pulled into a small diner, a familiar place where he often stopped for a cup of coffee to clear his head after a long day of work. The place was nearly empty, save for a few truckers hunched over their meals. He slid into a booth in the back, placing his hands flat on the table as he stared out the window. The stillness of the diner was the kind of peace he needed after the chaos of the gas station. He ordered coffee and a simple breakfast, just something to ground him before he headed home. The waitress was a young woman, barely out of her teens, who seemed to recognize him from her own childhood. Her eyes widened as she approached, and Michael's heart skipped a beat. For a brief moment, she seemed to be holding back words, unsure if she should say something. Finally, she spoke. "I saw what happened at the gas station," she said softly, leaning in. Her voice was low, as though afraid to disturb the stillness around them. "I'm glad you were there. You handled it like a pro. I don't think anyone else would have stood up to those guys." Michael didn't respond immediately. Instead, he just looked at her, sensing the weight behind her words. "It wasn't about being a pro," he finally said, his voice quiet. "It was about not letting them think they could do whatever they wanted. It wasn't about me, it was about not letting people walk all over the next guy." She nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "I get it. We all need to stand up more. It's so easy to turn away when we see something wrong, to just mind our own business." She paused, then added, "But sometimes, we don't even realize how bad things are until someone else steps in." Michael watched her carefully, sensing that she wasn't just talking about the bikers. She was speaking about something deeper, something that affected more than just that moment at the gas station. The truth was, people had become used to ignoring the injustices around them. They had grown comfortable with pretending not to see things that were wrong, simply because it was easier. But standing up to the bikers had been more than just a heroic moment. It had been a wake-up call for Michael too. The world didn't always operate by the rules he had learned in the military. It wasn't always about power, control, or following a set of orders. Sometimes, it was about understanding that the world could be a hostile place, and you had to choose to make a difference. The waitress turned and walked back to the counter, her voice lingering in Michael's mind. The simplicity of her words hit him harder than he had expected. He realized that his life, his time in the service, had taught him how to fight, how to survive in difficult circumstances. But it had never really prepared him for the moments that required something more than just muscle or training. It hadn't prepared him for the moments that tested his moral compass, when the lines between right and wrong weren't as clear as they seemed. As he sipped his coffee, the weight of those thoughts settled deeper into his mind. The encounter at the gas station had left a mark on him, not because of the physical confrontation, but because of the realization that the world was full of people who had been waiting for someone to stand up for them. He had been that person that day, but how many other days would he pass by without stepping in? How many times had he stayed quiet when he could have said something? The question lingered in the air, unanswered. As the minutes passed, Michael's thoughts drifted to his military experience. He had spent years following orders, living by a code, and serving his country. He had fought battles, faced death, and made decisions that changed his life. But none of that had prepared him for the battle that lay ahead, the internal struggle of trying to make the right choices in a world that didn't always play fair. He had always thought of himself as a protector, someone who kept people safe. But now, as he sat in that quiet diner, he wasn't so sure what kind of protector he was. He finished his breakfast in silence, the waitress's words echoing in his head. The world was changing, and it wasn't always going to be kind. But if he could make a difference, even in small ways, it was worth it. He paid his bill, left a tip, and stood up to leave, feeling the weight of everything he had just experienced pressing down on him. As he stepped back into his truck, the night air was cool against his skin. The drive home was uneventful, but the night felt different. The quietness of the streets, the gentle hum of the tires against the asphalt, it all felt like a dream. Michael wasn't sure if he was still processing what had happened or if it was simply that the world seemed to move at a slower pace when you were no longer a part of the chaos. When he finally pulled into his driveway, the familiar sight of his house gave him a sense of relief. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment, watching the lights flicker on in the windows. He had been gone for so long, but now he was back. The world around him hadn't changed much, but he had. The events at the gas station had shifted something inside him, something he couldn't quite explain. It was as though he had been reminded of a truth he had forgotten, a truth that said standing up for what's right, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable, was the only way forward. But as he reached for the door handle, ready to put the night behind him, he caught sight of something in the rearview mirror. A car, headlights off, slowly rolling past his house. It didn't make any sense. No one should have been driving down this road at this hour. He stared for a moment, his heart beginning to beat faster. There was something strange about the way the car was moving, something that made him feel uneasy. It was just a passing thought at first, but as the car continued down the street, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something wasn't over. Michael sat in his truck for a moment longer, his gaze locked on the rearview mirror, trying to make sense of the car that had passed by so slowly. There was no reason for anyone to be out on his quiet street at this hour, not unless they had a purpose, and that alone sent a chill through his spine. His instincts, honed from years of military service, were screaming at him, telling him that something was off. It wasn't just the eerie stillness of the night, it was the way that car had moved, deliberately, as if someone inside was watching. Michael didn't believe in coincidences, not after everything that had happened. His gut told him that the encounter at the gas station wasn't over, not by a long shot. He stepped out of the truck, his boots hitting the gravel with a soft thud as he made his way to the front door. The neighborhood was peaceful, almost too peaceful, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he approached his house. The feeling that something was wrong, that he wasn't alone, persisted. He paused, scanning the street, but there was no sign of the car anymore. It had disappeared into the shadows, blending into the dark. He let out a breath, trying to shake off the sense of unease, but it was difficult to ignore. Inside, his house was as he left it. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the clock on the wall. Michael locked the door behind him and moved toward the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water. His mind was racing. The bikers, had they sent someone after him? It was a possibility. He knew that the gang members weren't the type to forget a humiliation. They could hold a grudge, especially if their pride had been wounded. But who would they send? And why now? The more he thought about it, the more the situation seemed to unravel. The encounter at the gas station had been a turning point. It had been more than just a fight, it had been a message, a challenge. And now, with this strange car passing by, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. As the minutes ticked by, he found it hard to sit still. He paced back and forth in the living room, his mind running through every scenario he could think of. The bikers had made their intentions clear. They hadn't been intimidated, not completely. They had tried to provoke him, tried to push him into a corner. They hadn't expected him to fight back, to stand up to them. But now, he wondered if they were going to retaliate, if they were going to come after him, or worse, his family. His heart thudded in his chest. He couldn't afford to take any chances. He pulled his phone out of his pocket and dialed his old unit. The line rang a few times before someone picked up. "Captain," the voice on the other end was gravelly, familiar. "What's going on?" Michael exhaled slowly. "I think they're on to me." The line went silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. "Who's on to you?" the voice finally asked. "The bikers. The ones I had the run-in with," Michael said, his eyes scanning the room, as if the walls themselves might be listening. "They didn't take too kindly to being put in their place. I'm starting to think they're planning something." The man on the other end chuckled softly. Sounds like you made an impression. But what makes you think they're coming after you? Michael hesitated. He wasn't sure if he should reveal the feeling he had, the strange sense of being watched, but the man on the other end had been there for him before. He trusted him. I saw a car drive past my house. Just now. Slow, like they were scouting the place out, Michael explained, the unease in his voice creeping in. I'm telling you, something doesn't feel right. The voice on the other end grew more serious. All right, I'll have a team keep an eye on things. You did good back at that gas station, Michael, but you're not in this alone. We'll make sure they don't do anything stupid. Stay sharp. Michael nodded, though the gesture was more for himself than anyone else. He hung up the phone, his thoughts still racing. He couldn't afford to be caught off guard. Not now. Not after everything he had already been through. The bikers, however, weren't the only threat he had to worry about. It was the ripple effect of his actions that worried him most. He thought about the way things had escalated at the gas station. He had stood up to those bikers, but he wasn't just challenging them. He was challenging the idea that some people were untouchable, that they could do whatever they wanted without consequence. The truth was, there were others who would see him as a problem, someone who had disrupted the order of things. The bikers, yes, but also the people who lived in the gray areas, those who took advantage of others because they could. Michael had disturbed that balance. And now, he was going to have to face the consequences. He took another sip of water, his hand shaking slightly. He couldn't afford to be afraid. Fear wouldn't help him now. What he needed was clarity, focus. He knew that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. There would be more danger, more moments where he would have to make quick decisions, decisions that could alter the course of his life. But he also knew that he wasn't alone in this. There were people watching his back now, people who would make sure that if trouble came, they were ready for it. As he sat there, in the quiet of his living room, the tension in the air was palpable. Every creak of the house, every sound from outside, felt amplified. He wasn't just waiting for the bikers anymore, he was waiting for the unknown, the inevitable clash that was bound to happen. Time seemed to stretch on for hours, but eventually, he heard the sound of a car engine outside. He tensed, his body going on high alert. His hand instinctively reached for the pistol he kept by the door, the cold metal grounding him in the moment. The car engine grew louder, then stopped. The sound of a door opening and closing followed. Michael held his breath. Then, the knock came. Slow, deliberate, like a warning. He didn't move at first, his mind racing. Was it them? The bikers? The stranger from the diner? Or was it someone else entirely? The knock came again, louder this time, as if demanding an answer. Michael stood up slowly, gripping the pistol with a steady hand. He wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. He wasn't going to let fear dictate his next move. He walked to the door, his heart pounding in his chest, and slowly turned the handle. What he saw when he opened the door stopped him cold. Standing there, in the dim light of the porch, was a face he knew. It wasn't one he had seen in years, but it was unmistakable. The man who had stepped in at the gas station. The stranger. Michael's heart skipped a beat as he looked at the man standing before him. His first instinct was to slam the door shut and grab his gun, but something in the stranger's eyes made him hesitate. The man wasn't a threat, at least not in the way Michael expected. There was no malice, no sense of danger in his posture. Instead, it was as if he had come here with a purpose, something important that needed to be said. Michael's grip on the door tightened, but he didn't back away. He kept his eyes on the stranger, trying to make sense of this unexpected visit. You don't remember me, do you? The man's voice was low, with a calmness that put Michael on edge. Michael scanned his face, trying to place him, but it wasn't immediately clear. The man was tall, well-built, with a weathered face that spoke of a life lived hard. His eyes, however, had a familiarity about them that Michael couldn't quite place. He furrowed his brow, narrowing his gaze. "Should I?" The man nodded slowly, his lips curling into a faint, almost knowing smile. "You do. You just don't know it yet. But you will." Michael remained silent, staring at the stranger as the seconds stretched on. There was something unsettling about his presence, something that felt out of place in the quiet of the suburban neighborhood. "What do you want?" Michael finally asked, his voice steady despite the growing tension. The man took a deep breath, as though preparing to reveal something significant. "It's not just the bikers you need to worry about. It's bigger than that. Much bigger." Michael's mind raced, a knot forming in his stomach. He hadn't realized how deep the situation was, how far the consequences of his actions stretched. He had thought that standing up to the bikers at the gas station would be the end of it, just a single confrontation, a small victory. But now, standing face to face with this stranger, he realized just how wrong he had been. "What are you talking about?" Michael's voice grew more insistent, though he still kept his guard up. The man stepped forward, lowering his voice so that only Michael could hear. "The bikers are just pawns in a much larger game. I know what you did at the gas station, and I know why you did it. But the people you're really messing with, they're not just some local gang. They have connections, resources, people who can make life very difficult for you." Michael felt his chest tighten as he absorbed the weight of the man's words. He had suspected that. There was more to the situation than met the eye, but hearing it confirmed made the reality all the more chilling. His actions had set off a chain of events that he couldn't control anymore. He was in over his head. The man continued, his voice calm but urgent. "You've got to understand, the bikers are just one part of the puzzle. They're being used to send a message, and that message is about power, about dominance. You've stepped into a world you don't fully understand. A world where people don't take kindly to being crossed." Michael could feel the heat rising in his chest, frustration building. He didn't like the direction this conversation was taking. "So, what now? You're here to warn me?" The stranger's eyes softened, almost as if he was trying to gauge Michael's reaction. "I'm here to help you. To give you the information you need to protect yourself, to survive what's coming." Michael's thoughts whirled as he processed the man's words. He didn't know who this stranger was or what his connection to the situation was, but there was something about him that seemed genuine. Still, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled into something much bigger than himself, something that he wouldn't be able to escape from so easily. "I'm not asking for help," Michael said, his voice low and tense. "I've got this under control." The stranger shook his head, a sad expression crossing his face. "That's where you're wrong. You don't. This isn't something you can fight alone. Not against these people. They're everywhere. They're watching you right now. And they're not going to stop until they get what they want." Michael didn't flinch, though his pulse quickened at the thought. He couldn't afford to be scared. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. "Who are they?" The stranger's gaze flickered toward the street, as if he was checking for anyone nearby. After a brief pause, he looked back at Michael and spoke in a lower voice. "They're not just bikers. They're part of a larger organization. A network. People who know how to handle situations like yours, people who won't hesitate to escalate things." Michael's mind spun with the implications of what the man was saying. A network? A larger organization? This was far beyond a simple altercation at a gas station. He had unknowingly crossed a line, and now he was stuck in the middle of something much darker, something that could have far-reaching consequences. "So, what's the plan?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the weight of the situation settling on him. He was no longer in control. This was no longer about him trying to make a stand, it was about surviving. The stranger took a step closer, lowering his voice even further. The first thing you need to understand is that they won't hesitate to strike when you least expect it. You can't predict when or where it will happen, but it's coming. And when it does, you need to be ready. Michael's pulse raced, and his mind spun with questions, but he didn't interrupt. He needed answers. You're not going to be able to take them down by yourself, the stranger continued. But there's a way out of this. A way to turn the tables. But you'll need to trust me. You'll need to trust that what I'm telling you is the truth, because the longer you wait to make a move, the harder it's going to get. Michael stood in silence for a long moment, weighing his options. He didn't know this man, didn't know what his motives were, but everything inside him screamed that this wasn't just some random encounter. This was bigger than him, bigger than the bikers, bigger than everything he had faced so far. "I'll need time to think about it," Michael finally said, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "But I'm not trusting anyone without more information." The man nodded, as though he had expected the response. "I understand. But remember this, you're not alone in this. You never were. There's always someone watching, and sometimes, it's better to have someone on your side than to go up against everything alone." With that, the stranger turned and walked away, leaving Michael standing on his doorstep, his mind racing with the possibilities. What had he just gotten himself into? And how far were these people willing to go to get what they wanted? As the man disappeared into the night, Michael was left with a single, undeniable truth: the real battle was only just beginning. And the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. Michael stood motionless in the quiet of his doorstep, his mind whirling with the stranger's cryptic warning. He barely noticed the cold night air seeping into his skin as his thoughts churned. What did this man know? And why was he helping him? The questions piled up one after the other, each answer slipping through his fingers like sand. One thing was clear: this wasn't just about a fight with some bikers. No, it was much larger than that. The threat looming over him was connected to something deeper, something that could change everything about his life. The next few days passed in a blur, each one filled with tension and uncertainty. Every time he left his house, he half expected someone to be watching him, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The strange man's words echoed in his mind, and with every passing hour, the weight of the situation grew heavier. Despite his initial reluctance, Michael found himself replaying their conversation over and over again. What was the network the stranger had spoken of? Who were these people, and why were they targeting him? The more he thought about it, the more he realized he had no choice but to take this seriously. He had gone from a man trying to protect his pride to someone facing an enemy whose reach he couldn't fathom. And if he wasn't careful, it wasn't just his life that could be destroyed, it could affect everyone around him. The thought made his stomach churn. Michael made a decision. He needed to learn more about this network and the bikers who were merely pawns in the grand scheme. If he was going to survive this, he would have to outsmart them. That meant doing what he had always avoided, getting involved with people he didn't trust, making deals with individuals whose motives were unclear, and accepting the help of people who didn't necessarily have his best interests at heart. But the alternative was worse: he couldn't live in fear, constantly looking over his shoulder. As the days went by, he began to pay closer attention to everything around him. He drove the same routes, walked the same streets, but with a new sense of vigilance. Every motorcycle that passed by, every stranger who crossed his path, was a potential threat. The world he had once known, calm, predictable, controlled, was slipping away from him. And all he had to show for it was the growing sense of paranoia gnawing at his insides. It wasn't long before Michael received his first warning. He was in the local convenience store, picking up a few items, when a man walked in. The man's appearance was unremarkable: average height, a plain black hoodie, and jeans. He looked like anyone else, but it was the way he moved that caught Michael's attention. The man was too deliberate, too aware of his surroundings. He stood at the counter, placing a pack of gum and a drink on the counter before Michael. He looked up, locking eyes with him briefly, but there was something cold in his gaze, something dangerous. Michael paid for his items, trying to maintain his composure, but as he left the store, the man followed him. Michael didn't make the mistake of thinking it was just a coincidence. He picked up his pace, walking quickly to his car, and made sure to keep an eye on his surroundings. As he slid into the driver's seat, he saw the man in his rearview mirror, standing by the store's door, watching him intently. Michael didn't wait to see what happened next. He drove away as fast as he could, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the beginning of something he couldn't escape. He wasn't just being watched anymore. He was being hunted. Over the next few days, Michael's paranoia deepened. The man from the store never showed up again, but his presence lingered in the back of Michael's mind. It wasn't just about the bikers or the strange man who had warned him. It was about the realization that his life was no longer his own. Every step he took, every decision he made, was being monitored, calculated, and manipulated. His every move could lead to his downfall. Desperation led him to take the next step. He contacted the stranger again. He wasn't sure if he was ready to trust him completely, but he knew he needed information, and he wasn't going to get it sitting in his house, hoping things would blow over. The meeting was set in an old, run-down diner at the edge of town, a place where no one asked questions and everyone minded their own business. Michael arrived early, scanning the parking lot for any signs of trouble. He was already on edge, and every passing car seemed like a potential threat. When the stranger finally arrived, it was in the same manner as before, calm, collected, and completely at ease. He slid into the booth across from Michael, a faint smile on his face. "You're here," the stranger said simply, his voice low. Michael didn't waste time with pleasantries. "What's going on? Who are these people? What do they want from me?" The stranger leaned back in his seat, folding his hands together. "You've stepped into a world you don't understand. It's a world where power is everything. Where connections, money, and influence rule. These people, this network, they don't care about right or wrong. They care about control. And they'll stop at nothing to maintain it." Michael felt a wave of frustration wash over him. He had heard enough of these vague statements. "Stop with the riddles. I need specifics. Who are they? What's their plan?" The stranger's eyes darkened, and for the first time, Michael saw a flicker of real emotion in his face. "They're everywhere. They've infiltrated every level of society, business, law enforcement, government. The bikers you've dealt with? They're just the tip of the iceberg. The people behind them are far more dangerous, far more powerful. And if you think this ends with you standing up to them, you're wrong. They'll destroy everything you love before you even realize it." Michael swallowed hard. He had no idea how deep this ran, how far it stretched. But it was clear now, he had no choice but to fight. Not just for his own survival, but for the safety of those around him. "Then help me," Michael said, his voice suddenly firm, his resolve strengthening. "Tell me what I need to do." The stranger's lips twitched in something resembling a smile, but it was tinged with something far darker. "You're already in this. You can't back out now. But there is a way forward. It won't be easy. And it won't be without consequences. But it's the only chance you have." Michael leaned forward, his eyes burning with determination. "Then I'll do whatever it takes." The stranger nodded, and in that moment, something passed between them, an unspoken understanding. Michael was no longer just a man trying to survive. He was now a player in a dangerous game, a game where every move could mean life or death. And as the stranger outlined the steps Michael needed to take, he knew this was just the beginning. The real fight was still ahead, and there was no turning back now.